Welcome everybody to the, what's today's date? September 10th, Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Like I said, we have a lot to cover today. I'll pass it over to Catherine to see if she has any opening remarks or thoughts to share with us.
I do not. We have a packed agenda, so let's get to it.
Okay. I do want to start by just like upfront thanking everybody for a lot of work that's been happening the past couple of weeks, even before that, but especially around the strategies and actions. And you know, I think we're getting definitely closer. It's exciting to see it all come together. So right up front, big profound thank you to everybody for all of your work. So first things first, there is the agenda there's a quick update to the agenda that was sent out by Marion just a few minutes ago. And we are going to pass it over to Jane and Marion to do an overview of the, do I have this right? No, I'm sorry. I have the wrong agenda up.
No problem. Stakeholder engagement, right?
Right. And why don't I pass it to you and I'll get up our actual, I have the stakeholder agenda up. I don't have like our meeting agenda up.
Sure. So after we do our initial organizing and review, we'll talk about our rural community stakeholder engagement event. We'll hear updates from our pathway leads. And then we'll talk about prioritization and have public comment. As always, we keep our meetings informal. So if you're a member of the public and you want to jump in, please just raise your hand and we'll insert you as we go rather than waiting until the last 5 minutes. Does anyone have any changes to the agenda they would like to suggest or any changes to the minutes? All right, hearing none, we will move forward with the agenda and we will consider the minutes accepted. So I'm going to turn it over to Marion first, because I'm assuming you're going to share your screen.
I am. Give me one moment here. Sorry, it's tough with the TV over here. There we go. All right, so we only have 5 minutes dedicated to this on the agenda, but sorry, I can't see anyone now. Oh, there we go. Okay, give me a moment here. Ooh, technology. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes to talk about this. I did send it out to everyone about, I don't know, an hour ago. So sorry if it was a quick time to review. Catherine Dimitrick and I met on this morning to talk a bit about her presentation at the beginning of this agenda and then the breakout questions. So what I'd like to touch upon today with this, and then welcome folks to take a look at it when you have more time and send us feedback, is really to talk about the breakout questions and then to touch base with everyone on sharing this with your networks. And if you've heard any feedback from folks that are looking for more information to share or aren't sure where to go, we can share that. Quick update, we have 35 people that are officially registered for the event. So that's a good start. And I think we're excited to see those numbers go up. I did share early last week a save the date, and I'm happy to share that again with folks. We also have a new website, which I think there will be an announcement sent out to subcommittees and the council today. But this event is on the new website as well, so that can also be a place for folks to share with your networks to sign up for this event. So we went over this agenda last time. I'm not going to go into too much detail. The big updates for folks are Ted Brady has agreed to do a presentation or talk a little bit about a municipality that may have done a really exciting shift to address flooding or other resilience efforts. I think he's going to need some assistance in developing that presentation, but Jane has identified she has a couple of towns in her towns that we could have presentations on. So I think we'll be able to work on that with Ted. And then Catherine has agreed to give an overview of all of the pathways. And this won't be a long presentation. What we're thinking is having a review of the pathways and potentially some strategies that Catherine may just share with folks, but not having too much on the slides on the screen, as well as sharing the vision that we worked on a couple weeks ago. And we think the vision, while broad, will really help frame up the conversation about what does success look like in terms of adaptation and resilience and mitigation, and then be able to frame up the questions about what capacity is needed at a rural municipal level to get to that sort of success vision for those communities. And then we do also want to, oh, go ahead. Someone have a question? Or do I just need, I think I just need to mute people. Okay.
I had my hand up.
Go ahead, Mike.
If we go back to the Ted Brady one, I have left Ted a message on Jane's idea. But I just, how can we close that gap and help him, I guess is, Jane, does it sound like you're volunteering to get him the information, or I just want to make sure I'm not
That was an off-the-cuff idea based on the community I live in, so I'm happy to raise it now for you all, which just briefly, I in my email to the group, I suggested that it would be easy to, I think, easier, I should say, to lift up and give an example of a town that has done a good job in resilience planning. But if we were trying to think about how towns and or communities have addressed capacity in order to do this work, I just thought of my own community in that the Mad River, we have the planning district, so we don't have any single town planner because our towns are too small, but we have 4 towns in a watershed that give communally to pay for a planner who thinks at a watershed level in our area to think about resilience planning, as well as a number of other things. But he's really excellent and focuses on how to receive in money and build capacity within our towns. If that is an example that people are interested in and would like to roll with, I'd be more than happy to connect Ted with Josh Schwartz, who's the executive planning director, and would easily, I'm sure, have a small presentation or example to provide to Ted.
And it looks like Chris put some suggestions for Barry, Brattleboro, and Brandon in the chat as well. And Digger did a profile on Jamaica, if I'm remembering correctly, that includes a video. So that could be a good resource to just use that too.
They're great. I'm not.
But I think that your question, Mike, is that your job to figure that all out for Ted? I think the answer is no.
Yeah, take that, Mike, and close the loop. I guess the question is,
you can come to consensus on the idea.
Yeah, we should, I think, decide as a group, Jane's suggestion of sort of an example of, we could do 2. We could do an example of sort of a group of municipalities that have figured out how to build capacity, and then a specific example of a project or something that Chris is, I haven't looked at the chat, but let's decide as a group which stories or ideas we want to share, understanding that we gave Ted like 10 minutes to do this presentation, so it's not a whole lot of time. And then, Mike, let's figure out if you want us to communicate directly with Ted or if there's someone else at VLCT that we should work with on that.
One suggestion perhaps is that the ag group worked closely with me last night when we met, Pat's here, on revising the presentation for the overview of the GWSA, and we really narrowed it down to a few slides. I expect that those slides could be used for Marion or whoever delivers the opening message for this event, as well as the other forestry ones. We can use the same opening, and that really will only take 5 minutes. Okay. So maybe you could give Ted 15 minutes because people are probably more excited about example than they are about.
So what do folks think? What would be a good opening story or 2 for Ted Brady to give?
I think
like
it's good
the
to
idea.
go ahead, Mike.
I like the idea of the Mad River Valley coming together. I think that's an example of how you can overcome a resource issue. I also like the thought, I watched the special on Jamaica as well. And, I almost feel like Jamaica can speak to how much things are changing, and then maybe follow up with how the Mad River has figured out how to deal with that, something along that line.
What do we think?
Just to confuse matters, the example towns I have probably have some good before and after pictures, and they can often kind of telegraph the point you're trying to make, that communities can do this, respond to these events. So just an additional thought. And maybe it's a bit of both. Here's an example of a town boosting capacity by thinking creatively, working together. And here's an example of a city doing something, or a larger town doing something in response.
I mean, we could keep, like one slide for each example almost, so we could do more than two. It could be pretty quick, couple bullets on each, so folks get a flavor of some different capacity building projects and examples. So we could do the Matter of Valley, we could do Jamaica, and we could do one of the towns that Chris is suggesting with before and after photos, if that makes sense. What do we think?
Sounds good.
Thumbs
Oh,
up?
that sounds good. If there's no other suggestions, we'll let Marion work on these finer points, and maybe can we look at the questions really quick, just being cognizant of time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Catherine. So
Thanks,
Catherine,
Marion.
do you actually want to, so Catherine and I touched base quickly this morning, just thinking about questions for the breakout group. So I think understanding we have an hour for breakout groups, we do think it would be beneficial to focus sort of one set of questions on three things: GHG emission reduction requirements, specifically as they relate to the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I think this is in part because in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the subcommittee is specifically charged with thinking about best practices for fossil fuel reduction in rural communities. It's a really important charge for the subcommittee. It's tied to Pathway 3. And it would be interesting and good to get feedback from communities about things where they've seen success and areas where they may need capacity help. And then also tying it to adaptation and resilience efforts, as that's also very much a charge of this subcommittee. So we thought of sort of breaking it out into three sets of questions, maybe 20 minutes or so on each set of questions, understanding that the facilitator in each group will be prepared with some more specific questions to help keep discussion going. And for that, we might pull from some of the action conversation that we're going to have today about questions that you all have or things that may be good to run by folks. But generally asking, what are the challenges that you as rural communities or organizations that work with rural communities face around emissions, so mitigation, resilience and adaptation, asking what best practices have you heard or seen that you think your community would benefit from, and then asking what your community needs to achieve success in this area. And knowing, especially for that last question, that we'll likely hear, oh, well, we need more staff support and we need more money, equipping the facilitators to really dive into the details of that. Well, what do you need money to do? What is that specific problem you're trying to solve? What's the program that you really want to get off the ground that you haven't been able to? So really trying to dive in so that we get some fodder for action development. But I'll stop there. Do folks have reactions to these questions before we wrap this one up? Anything I missed, Catherine?
No, that was great and quick. So I know we're throwing these new questions at you, so we do have time. It's not until Thursday. The save the date doesn't have any of these details.
Wednesday.
Wednesday. I keep saying Thursday. Thank you for correcting me. So if you want to sit on these and look at the questions and give some thought about how you think that they will work, that would be great. And Joe made an important point that is taken about making sure when we ask these questions, we share the definition of resilience and adaptation so that it's understood what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. That'll be, I can't see the chat, sorry for missing that. We'll include those in the presentation around the pathways. So that'll be included there.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other thoughts? The last quick thing I'll say is, I don't see Jens on the call, but Joe, Catherine Morris reached out about your offer to help facilitate or take notes. So it sounds like we'll have a good group of folks. And I think Catherine is trying to set up a training just briefly on Monday. Catherine, what time is that?
11 o'clock.
I checked your calendar, Joe. It looked like you were free, but if not, let us
Yeah,
know.
I got it. Thank you.
Great. Okay. And then if anyone else is interested in helping be a backup facilitator or note taker, let me know and we can include you in on that conversation on Monday. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I'll stop sharing the screen. Back to
And now I
you.
think we can move into our conversation about the pathways.
Awesome.
Chris Cochran, I have pathway 1, 4, and 5. Do you want me to share my screen and you can just tell me to click through?
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
All right, hold on.
Eric,
Oh, wait, do you have the right version? There's a corrected version.
I have the version you sent me.
Okay, I sent an updated one to Marion.
I can
11.
share. I have the updated version.
It's,
I don't think it went to you, Erica. It just went to
yeah,
me.
it's not a big deal.
Right.
There was a mistake on the front slide.
I got it. I'll share it and
Right.
then Erica, you focus on.
And Eric and Catherine, what I'll do this is I will keep time. So presenters, we're going to give you about 5 to 7, so we have time for discussion. So I'll just give you kind of a 5-minute warning and a 7-minute stop, and then we'll make sure we have time for talking. Okay.
All right, I'm going to try to make this as speedy as possible. And then, of course, I just see another typo. It's Jens, not Jen, Hilke. But thanks to, this is the group that helped me on pathway 1, 4, and 5. Brahman was going to present this, but she's unable to make it today. So I'm going to pinch hitting for her. Quickly, just a little bit about our process. There was a lot of different strategies and actions. What we work to do is, to the extent possible, a lot of the strategies were actually actions when you got down to it. So we worked to kind of roll these things up together to kind of combine the strategies. It made for, you'll see, some pretty long sentences, but I think collapsing them did make some sense because it allowed us to bucket a lot of actions underneath them.
Chris, we're seeing not presenter mode, but we're looking at you as if you're seeing like 2 slides and like details below. I don't know if you can switch it to under display settings at the top, I think. Just so it'll be bigger for people to see. I think if you go to the far, yeah, there you go. Yeah, yep, you got it.
And then we went through as groups, and this is consistent for all of these things, and identified, actions that were unclear, that lacked specificity, actions that were duplicates, and actions that probably could or should move to other pathways because they were more appropriate there. So with that, I'm just going to jump into pathway 1. Next slide, please. And this is how I tell people never to make a slide because it's too many words. But here's where we are. So I categorize this as the kind of need money, need staff, need capacity pathway. There wasn't a whole lot of, the things are pretty clear, the kind of what we need to do here. If we want to make these things change, we really need to put money and resources behind this, and especially for our rural areas that lack the staff and capacity. I don't think you guys need me to read these, but I can just cite, there's a few examples, and this is not exclusive of all of the actions. This is just a sampling. So I encourage everybody to look at the broader list if you want to kind of dive into the details. And if you don't see a particular action here, it doesn't mean it was cut. It's just not, it wasn't enough room to put all these slides in there. So the first one is, we need funding to make these things happen. And a couple different examples underneath there. Increase, more funding. And then this was yet one item that Jens was particularly wanted to see was creating additional staffing capacity in the regional planning commissions to do forest planning. Tools, strategy, the next strategy, provide tools and resources to help communities assess their vulnerabilities. This is something that ACCD did several years ago in the wake of Irene. I think what resilience is going to look like on the community level is really different and very local. And the examples that I was citing in that initial conversation in Barry, Brandon, and Brattleboro, we basically did a vulnerability assessment and identified opportunities to improve the resilience of the community. It worked. They implemented a lot of great projects that will protect the town and their local economy from future floods. So more of that. Communities need resources and tools to make these things happen. I'll pause there. Any questions? Just keep on rolling. We learned from Irene too that it's a kind of a patchwork quilt that you need to knit together to pull all these things together. But you need money and resources to make sure that happens. And many of these things We need, you hear every day about how we struggle with the workforce. It's gotten worse due to the pandemic, but we really need people with specialized skills to help implement some of these things. One thing we also learned in the pandemic was that we can be pretty effective meeting and collaborating remotely. So communities need more tools and resources to use the broadband resources that the state's investing in to convene, gather people, hear what their needs are. Next slide. And these are just a sampling of actions that were in this initial bucket that we recommended moving to other pathways. I think some of the mapping is pretty obvious, and we were pretty detailed in our note taking. These got mapped and moved to other locations, or that's our recommendation. And I'm not going to go into all these unless there's questions. Really, nothing really controversial or that would raise the level of, we need the Climate Council to weigh in on this particular pathway, in my opinion.
So are you ready for questions, Chris?
Yeah.
Great. So any questions on the first slide in terms of general strategies and actions, or kind of moving things around? We'll give you a minute to look at this too.
I think there's just a couple of additions that were late additions yesterday, Chris, that I can talk about. There was my email to you and Bronwyn. I had proposed to reword the first strategy on that first slide. If you want to roll back one slide, Marion. There we go. So this provides sufficient and dedicated funding for successful resilience and adaptation activities. I just wanted to try and refine that a little bit. And so I can put my suggested refinement in the chat for folks to read if you would like to see it, but it's establish permanent statewide support for local and regional preparedness, response, and recovery functions necessary to enhance overall rural resilience to hazards exacerbated by climate change. So it's really zeroing in on resilience to hazards exacerbated by climate change, but as well as directing funding and resources towards that. And I don't know if that's something that if that's wording folks would be interested in. I'll put it in the chat. Also, there's a couple of additional actions that I had suggested be added. So we'll just I can put those in the chat and we can discuss later on if folks want to.
Erica, do you want to put the strategy language in the chat, and maybe let's look at that and then take a look at that.
I have a question, and it's probably applicable to what we've written too. Is when you say increase funding for local and regional climate, et cetera, as an action, it's kind of like, well, how, and funding for who, and so like if that's an action, what exactly is the action we're taking?
Right.
And is this and maybe this is a question for Jane or Marion, but is this sufficient level of detail for what you are looking for in the actions?
And Joe, to your point, like, action 1 is more general and action 2 is very specific, right? In terms of the way those two are.
Yeah. I mean, action 2, you can kind of absolutely picture what that means.
Yeah, to follow up on Joe's point, I agree that first action is pretty broad. And when you think about it from the perspective of eventually we're going to want to do some assessment on these actions across the foundational criteria, including equity and technical feasibility and a couple of other categories. This action, it seems so broad that we wouldn't really be able to accurately assess at that level. So maybe it's just breaking down into a couple of specific actions around, increasing funding for these types of programs, increasing funding for this type of project design. I mean, maybe it's not, ideally you're calling out sort of one program or one policy. If you don't want to get to that level, it could be a little higher than that. But I think grouping like local regional initiatives, project design, scoping, adaptation, and mitigation, I think that could probably be broken down into some more specific actions.
And
yeah,
to add, there are a bunch of very specific actions within there.
Yeah.
And that's, maybe this is a quick question, because I think, right, because and each strategy probably has any number of actions. I know, Chris, you were just trying to kind of give people a flavor.
Yep.
So the question is, as you think about this for you all and then ultimately for the Climate Council, do you want like, a slide per strategy with a bunch of more specific actions, or more of a flavor of things like this here? And probably thinking about how much detail you want to go into with the Climate Council in presentation. They'll have the spreadsheet and all that as well.
I think it's hard. I mean, the details do matter, but I think it's really hard, and given the length of those meetings, to really dive into the details, and given where we are on time. I mean, I think it's going to have to be a couple samples. I just don't see how. And then encouraging everybody to actually read all the details in advance, and they can bring those onto the table and for discussion if that's needed.
I think getting buy-in to the strategies, because they're just a little bit more digestible and there's fewer of them. Maybe that's the more critical thing.
And maybe
Pat, just quickly. So that's the intent, is that the cumulative work of all the pathway strategies and all the actions will be shared a week ahead of time, so that that information can be digested amongst counselors. And I think Chris is right that as you present it, you'll want to elevate certain actions that you want to flag based on issues or discussion that you want to have around those actions. But I don't think that you'll be able to go through your whole list, but they will have it so that we'll be able to direct specific questions and guidance at the meeting to ensure any red flags are posed as soon as possible, so that as you're fleshing them out with more detail, that based on the council. And the schedule that we'll talk about with the council on Tuesday will articulate the review of the materials heading out to the council, the review of those materials in an open meeting at a council, and then written feedback to be directed to Marian and I to be circulated to the subcommittees.
Thanks, Jane. It looks like we've got a couple of things in the chat. One, Erica did put her proposed strategy language in for people to take a look at. And then an additional action under pathway 1, strategy 3, which was actually related to my question, which is that there wasn't anything related to the community organizations shown as an example. And I think it's important to include one as an example action. And then Anne just wants some clarification about what the VERY model is.
I'm going to answer the last one easily. It's the Vermont Economic Resiliency. Actually, resiliency isn't a word, but that's what we called it. And it did what I just discussed. It did local vulnerability assessments. It provided tools and resources, consultants to help community. So look at their flood risk, identify opportunities to reduce those risks, prioritize projects, and then implement those projects.
Maybe let's take to Catherine's point. You want to take the Erica's strategy rewording. Maybe people should look at that first and see if that is acceptable, or some obligation between the two.
And I think I'm probably missing. So I've got local and regional preparedness, response, and recovery, but missing a key piece of the cycle, which is hazard mitigation / climate adaptation. That's probably something we need to just add into there.
I have no concerns about adding this. I think that makes sense. And I apologize, I didn't get this in. I was bouncing a few balls. So,
well, yeah, I think we were, the emails were flying. So,
anybody have a concern about Erica's rewording? If not, we can fold that in.
I think as long as adaptation's thrown back in, it looks great.
Okay, great.
Maybe for the VERY question, we could take out VERY and make it more of a
generic, yeah.
Yeah, so that we don't have that same translation issue that Anne faced.
Me too.
Yeah. And we were kind of under the gun to get all this done. I would like to go through these and kind of do a proper tidy up. It was just kind of like,
yeah, they look great. Like the amount of time you all had to work on this, it's quite remarkable what you come up with.
Thanks.
And by the way, Chris, we'll save the chat because there's some good stuff on this side. So I think a question to Catherine's point and also in Erica's, I guess there's a suggestion maybe for the Climate Council, knowing these are in the spreadsheets, is maybe, again, a little bit of alteration of some of the actions. Potentially, one of the ones that Erica put in is very focused on equity in some ways, which is really good. So people you may want to think about just some juggling of the action examples for those reasons.
Yeah, there's the one related to the state individual assistance program that that builds off of a model that exists in some states, not a lot of states, but North Carolina in particular has a state level individual assistance program, which is meant to fill in gaps for uninsured and underinsured folks that are impacted by disasters that are not declared by the federal government. And in Vermont, that's a lot. There are a lot of disasters that don't provide individual assistance from the federal level, and it's a known gap in Vermont, and we have folks that are subject to repetitive loss because it's a self-defeating cycle for them.
One other question in chat, I noticed Chris kind of put a question about whether we should put something in more directed at heat, potentially just to elevate that as an issue that sometimes I think folks may forget about, at least some of the time. I don't know if people have thoughts about that. Chris, go ahead.
It's more than just heat, it's more looking at the human health impacts of climate change. So like the heat wave in 2018 killed 4 in Vermont, that's more than our floods typically kill. We're going to have more outdoor air quality issues from smoke coming out west. And that's probably going to become more of a perpetual issue in the east going forward, as that just becomes a fixture of life out west. And if our folk have their windows open, remember we had air quality days to trigger asthma attacks and other things. So it's just looking at, I would just suggest an addition to or contemplating another action in terms of specifically calling out prevention as an adaptation resilience strategy, being more aggressive, like in cooling centers, but also we may actually really need to start thinking about air quality refuges too. And there was a really good story on NPR, I'll put it in the chat, about poor indoor air quality when there's wildland smoke fire out in the air. Again, that's not going to necessarily be our issue. But it's just something to think about that, on these bad air quality days, if folk here are still trying to cool off, they've got fans in the windows, we may need to be thinking about those kinds of things. So anyway, I know Department of Health has been focused as a whole, has been doing a lot of work on health impacts related to climate change, and may just want to.
Yeah, it's a great, I know Jared Ulmer from Department of Health, and I'll absolutely check in with him and make sure that it's a good gap. So thanks for pointing that out. It is a big gap.
Jared had initially sat in on some of these meetings, but Department of Health, I think, is back in their tier 1 status for COVID. So he's not able to engage, but if we could send him some actions, he may be able to help review and add some detail.
I think there's a preparedness and planning element to that too, in terms of supporting the development of prevention activities at the local level. A lot of towns have identified shelters, and they identify whether they are a cooling or a warming shelter, but there isn't a lot of substance in terms of operationalizing those plans, and there's certainly no regional cooling centers that the state directs opening of as we do regional shelters.
The question.
That's good. That's a good catch, Chris, for sure.
So in terms of because we'll have to move on to 2 here soon. So in terms of next steps here, co-chairs, what's the best way for Chris helping with Brahman lead this one? How should we proceed in terms of just next steps with the slides and comments?
I think as specifically for these comments, we have planned on meeting again just to do a little bit of further refinement based on the comments of this group. So I think we can take these comments and make sure that we get the additional language added in.
Catherine, was it you? Sort of another voice there for a second.
Yeah, I think I support that. I think there needs to be a big all pathway look at things, look where things are moving, make sure that the language is consistent. I mean, when I start talking about the land use section, there's potential for a lot of different interpretations and inconsistencies. So we do need to spend some time working this out.
Great. And Chris, that mostly happen among the full group here, or do you guys go back to smaller kind of pathway work groups or task groups to do that?
I personally think it needs to be like one person kind of just getting through it, just so the logic's consistent, and then reviewed by a smaller group and then shared with the whole group, just to make sure that we hadn't missed anything.
Okay.
So if I can offer a potential way, because as folks have been emailing these, I've been pulling the specific tabs into sort of a master document that I'm keeping on our SharePoint. So if folks are taking notes, and I would encourage, as you're presenting or your pathway lead is presenting, take notes on what folks are giving in terms of feedback. But I can also access the chat after the meeting and send me any updates by early next week. I can then compile it into one Excel document. Catherine, Eric, and I are meeting, and we can kind of determine next steps. But it may be, I may be the person to kind of look across all of those and then send that full spreadsheet back to the subcommittee to think about at our meeting next week, Friday. But if folks want to send me directly any edits in your spreadsheets, I can pull it all into one place.
And Mary, that's the more detailed spreadsheets, right? With everything. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Okay, Chris, Coach, anything else on this before we go to 2, just because of time?
All good.
All right. Number 2 is Joe, I think.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen.
Go for it.
I'm not going to go to presenter mode because it's all text. You should be able to see it. And that way I can kind of my eyes on you guys. Yeah, so our group included Mike Burke, Cochran, and myself. We met a couple times, and I think the challenge is there was in pathway, I'll just describe what pathway 2 is to remind people. It's to proactively and strategically invest to enhance resilience in transportation, communications, water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure. So it's kind of the resilience for infrastructure pathway. And there was a long list of items that we sort of realized kind of quickly that, that the language was, many of them were kind of written in a strategy kind of way, and there was definitely some repeats or some generally similar types of things on the list. So a big part of it is just trying to figure out how to consolidate these down into actions. We come up with these 4 strategies based on kind of what we were reading. The first one is to create a policy planning and organizational foundation to support effective investments in infrastructure resilience. So it's about planning organizational foundation. The second one is really the response, being prepared to respond and recover quickly from severe weather and other climate change threats. The third one focuses on reducing vulnerabilities of specific facilities. And it's useful to think about that in comparison to number 4, which is taking more of a systems-wide approach to improving resiliency. So, in my world, we may, number 3 would be about improving the flood resilience of a specific bridge at a specific location, where number 4 might be about providing multiple modes on a system-wide basis, because the more modes you have, the more resilient you are. So just thinking about those kind of different levels. And there can be, there's similar examples for utilities and probably water, wastewater. I will say that what we don't have is any action specific to water, wastewater. We just haven't had any participation from that infrastructure sector and this work. So I'll give you a few examples for each strategy. So strategy 2.1 was create a policy planning and organizational foundation. So the first one is creating a flood resilience program to meet the requirements and the investments that are going to be available for money that's coming from the federal reauthorization. So this will be money that we can actually use to proactively address flood resilience and other resiliency issues on the transportation system. Huge opportunity, and it's really real. The second example is updating infrastructure design standards to account for major disruptions and also the incremental impacts of climate change. And so that's really, this is an example of, I was kind of pointing out previously, is that really an action? Because this could be broken down into different design standards for the different types of infrastructure. And so maybe there needs to be some refinement of that action. Or maybe it should be a strategy, but we're just trying to keep, the strategy somewhat limited. And the third example is create a framework for identifying and evaluating climate resilience threats and impacts to energy and communication systems serving rural communities. And Anne can talk more about that, but the feeling is that there's kind of a lack of a systematic approach to identifying, what the vulnerabilities are and maybe how they should be prioritized and addressed. Did I get that right, Anne?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's, I think we had a robust discussion about the difference between reliability, which, exists as a goal of energy policy, and it's a requirement of utilities to meet certain reliability requirements in statute and regulation and rule. So, reliability is kind of well framed out. Resiliency has, there's a Venn diagram where the two meet, and then there's a whole other world that resilience lives in, and that is a pretty new area. It doesn't, the word doesn't exist in state energy policy. Maybe it needs to, but short of that, we need some sort of way to all agree on, what does resilience mean? How much? Where? Obviously, the who pays question comes up. Ratepayer advocate hat. So that's the idea here, is we set up the framework so there's less contention and more agreement down the line about investments in resilience once those are actually proposed.
I mean, I see this. Sorry, go ahead. Or was that just my echo?
It was your echo.
Oh, yeah. Talking to myself. Who's that smart guy talking? Yeah, I mean, I think that last bullet, I see that as an action because, it's something that Anne could take on, right? And maybe developing this framework in partnership with the utilities and so on, and maybe it becomes operationalized somehow in whatever rules or however you kind of operate. So the next strategy about being prepared to respond and recover quickly. Maybe this strategy gets wrapped in or combined with another strategy in one of the other pathways, because I think it's probably a common theme about, because we were just talking about it with the last pathway, I think. But conduct joint preparedness exercises, simulating loss of energy, communications, and other critical infrastructure. I thought that already happened to some extent. But integrate planning and preparedness across disciplines and geographies, addressing interdependence of energy, communications, and other systems. Some really specific ones, provide rivers and roads training to municipalities, which is very actionable. And I think we can make that happen pretty quick. And then, sort of an ongoing challenge is just encouraging adoption of town, highway, road, and bridge standards by all municipalities, because it helps them, get more money when there's a disaster and build back stronger. I think there's still a high percentage, but we could do better. Any questions about this one?
There's some nice comments in chat. I'll just note that Chris is putting in, but any quick questions or comments here?
Okay, the third strategy is reducing vulnerabilities at specific facilities. There was lots of great discussion on this first bullet between Anne and Mike. And it was during normal replacement schedules for aging and unreliable electric and communication lines, evaluate and where cost effective and feasible, replace rural overhead lines with broad lines. So this is really about, this is about specific facilities, right? So when Green Mountain Power's out there and they're like, oh, we've got to replace all the lines on my street out here, East Street, and they're going to evaluate whether or not it's feasible to bury them. So it's kind of a specific, it maybe doesn't have a huge, you bury lines on my road, it probably doesn't have a huge system-wide impact, but it makes that specific facility more vulnerable. I mean, I'm sorry, less vulnerable. Anything else to add about that one, Ann or Mike?
The only thing that I was thinking was just, even if you don't go underground, you still want to make it more hardened and resilient. So I know we focused on underground, which would be the goal, but we probably have to add something in there just during the normal replacement schedules. Make sure we're becoming more resilient regardless, with the goal, the ultimate goal of going underground, something along that line. I can help you with that later.
Okay. The next bullet down is revising standards for enhanced regional and municipal energy planning to include identification of critical community facilities requiring uninterrupted energy. It's a long one. And communication services in the event of a disruption. And do you want to, can you explain that?
Yeah, just these, both of these, this and the next bullet, these haven't had a long life. So we're still kind of testing them out. We had to come up with some actions for this particular strategy. So this first one, obviously some folks on this call, Catherine and Chris, both Chris's, are familiar with the Act 174 Enhanced Energy Planning work, which right now is more about kind of identifying the best places from a sort of natural resource perspective and somewhat an aesthetic perspective to put renewable resources. And we haven't yet married up that concept of where we're going to put renewables with where we might also want to pair renewables with storage, for instance, or look at alternatives like really having redundant electric supply or redundant energy supply in general to those sort of last resort facilities, the emergency shelters, perhaps the supermarket, a gas station, et cetera. So this is another sort of let all our worlds collide, where can we, in the course of those energy plans, identify a facility or a handful of facilities that maybe the community could work in partnership with the utility to really focus on the resilience of that. Maybe it's a microgrid, maybe it's a particular building, that kind of thing. That's that first bullet there. And then the second bullet relates to having, flipping the coin and having utilities look at their critical facilities and in light of a changing climate. And this could be, just could be poles and wires, it could be substations, it could be sort of control centers, having utilities kind of look at their infrastructure in light of a changing climate. I would think some utilities are, Mike's probably going to say, well, we're already doing that.
We
Some
already do, thanks.
Yeah, some utilities may not be. So it's just sort of trying to level set that as an expectation, and that expectation would go into the integrated resource planning guidance that the department issues kind of on a regular basis.
Yeah, I noticed Chris posted some things that we are already doing, and those were the things, Chris, that we were talking about. So just to acknowledge your comments there.
Maybe Joe, keep going just because of time.
Okay. This is the last one. So improving system is the key word there, efficiency, reliability, and redundancies. So the first bullet is about updating the Agency of Transportation's design standards for highways. And we did a legislative study a while ago and really had this excellent work product on how to update our standards, and we just need to implement those. And it's about making, it's a multimodal system that supports smart growth. That's really ultimately what all the standards are about. Supporting remote work and teleservices to reduce the impact on travel disruptions. That one probably could be fleshed out more with some specific actions, but there's obviously a huge opportunity now to do that. And deploying foundational technology statewide to enable and optimize storage and other grid management technologies. So again, it's kind of a systems approach here. So I think where we're standing now is we have more work to do to refine that long list of other items and kind of try to make them, put them in action kind of language and make sure they're feasible.
Right. Other questions or comments about these? I think Dale has his hand up, or her. Sorry, Dale.
That's okay. Thank you. This is a comment actually about all of these Pathway 2 strategies. And I heard Joe acknowledge that there's not really anybody involved in this subcommittee who's an expert in water and wastewater issues, but just reflecting on the entirety of this set of strategies, I do think that that is something that is missing and is troubling. I think that, you know, increased flooding will affect our water quality issues. Heat can affect our water quality issues, the threat of drought. I just see it as a gap. And so would encourage the subcommittee to find a way to acknowledge that and at least put a placeholder in until there's someone who can provide some really good specifics.
Yeah, good point. Catherine and then Erica, co-chairs next.
Thanks for all your great work on this. I had a question and then a couple of comments. I remember when Mike and Ann presented early on, there were a lot of really great specifics around utility, energy utility. And I'm wondering if that's what Joe's referring to when he talks about those things you still need to review and refine, because I didn't want to lose those. Those were great.
Yeah.
So is that what, okay, great. And then my comments are that we seem to have lost any actions, and maybe they're just not up yet, related to permitting and how permitting of all of these utilities fits into this question and what changes we might need to make to permitting. And the other thing I'll throw out is there's no mention so far, maybe it's in land use, about environmental justice and green justice and bringing those concepts into utility development. Maybe that fits into the utility planning guidance or some other place, but it seems like that's a missing piece. And then finally, I'd like to throw out an action idea that would require a statutory change to enable specifically municipalities to adopt adaptation and resilience capital budgets and identify a funding source to help municipalities actually fund those. I have some funding source ideas, but I'd like to throw that out as an action that we include somewhere.
Right. Let me get Erica, then we might come back to all this good stuff coming out. Erica.
Go ahead, sorry.
We're just throwing all of our comments at you at once. First of all, this is really excellent suite of strategies, and I mean, just very thoughtful. So really good job thus far. Joe, you made a comment about the training and exercise piece of this and overall preparedness, and you know, maybe that fits into another spot. And I would just encourage us to actually keep it within this infrastructure bucket, because there's a lot of good work that happens at like the town and municipal level over general preparedness and training and exercise. And I think especially when we look at smaller utilities, there's more work to be done, especially to exercise a coordinated response or a coordinated regional response. And we're really talking about those catastrophic incidents that have implications that last for longer than multiple days and weeks. So just I would encourage keeping that in there, because I think that's a really important piece in terms of strengthening the resilience of the people that run infrastructure.
Let me go to Chris Campany and then Chris Cochran, and then we'll see where we are just because of time. Chris Campany.
And just a quick reminder, this is a cross-cutting issue. We really need to talk about it as part of the larger plan. Anytime that you're talking about municipalities, identifying things, planning to do things, et cetera, especially things that hinge on a town plan. Remember, first, towns don't have to have a plan. B, they can adopt a plan that does not comport with any state law whatsoever. They may not be able to get regional approval, but they may not care if they don't not interested in a certain relatively very limited suite of grants. So we just need to be real mindful of that. And that also gets to a fundamental, and you can say, well, that's up to the town, but then that gets to a fundamental equity and justice issues. You don't want a certain subset of the state's population not party or not participating in like the identification like of critical infrastructure and that kind of thing. So some of those things may be better done at the regional level. Well, we would certainly do it with with town contributions and town solicitation, but you may not want to rely on critical things putting at the municipal level. I'm saying this wearing my municipal interest hat for which I was appointed.
Chris, I can try first at that. And I think what we were trying to talk about was sometimes the utilities think they know where the town would want us to harden and become more resilient, but input from the town on areas that we may not be seeing could be pretty important.
So I don't disagree. I'm just saying, but if we're saying town should identify critical yada, 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 unless there's some law compelling them and some penalty, that may not happen. And frankly, a lot of them will not have the capacity to do that. And so that's probably going to happen at the regional level, working with the towns to develop that information. So I totally agree, Mike. And, we're collaborating together on that earmark request to create resiliency zones down here if that gets funded. So I'm all in. I'm just saying, be careful what you say municipalities will do or should do or expected to do, because in a lot of cases, they don't have to do a damn thing. And then that's going to create gaps. And we shouldn't just say, well, that's okay because it's up to the town.
And you all may want to decide, I mean, there is some capacity number one that covers this a little bit, but to Chris's point, you may want to talk about, you may have to be more explicit about what you're going to do about inequities when there's kind of local choice, which may mean not always local good choices. I know that's the challenging conversation.
Or maybe it's just a wording thing too. Involve the towns or regional planning commissions where there's capacity. It sounds like that's more the issue to me.
Got it. That's good. Awesome. Chris Cochran, then Mary, and then we're going to have to move on.
Quickly, I just wanted to flag for Catherine. There's in Pathway 4, there's a whole section on kind of coordinating regulations with resiliency in mind. So,
the other thing we didn't hit too is one of the pathways we were talking about. We often do infrastructure projects in silos all the time right now, and we were really trying to get to where we're actually doing road projects, power projects, communication projects all together instead of not, which happens right now. So thanks.
Marion or Jane? Marion, I guess.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly flag, I really appreciate that comment from Chris and the question around, actions that are being proposed by the subcommittee may have implications on the capacity that municipalities do or don't have, and that might be a specific thing we want to bring up at the rural community stakeholder event next week. So I think I'm not keeping notes on this, but if as you guys are presenting these, if there are certain things that are coming up like this that you think would be important to bring up at that event, either as an example of something to think about, if people say like, well, what types of things are you proposing that might impact our capacity? This would be a really good example to give. So I'm going to follow up with an email to everybody to start sending me ideas for those things so we can work with Catherine Morris to kind of coordinate the specific questions, but just wanted to flag that as one good example of conversation for next week.
Just one question before next step. So what about water? So I'm sort of mentioning the Vermont Rural Water Association. Is this something that we just don't have time to engage in? So we just have to note we're missing things there? Or do people need to make some effort to engage somebody in the next month or so? What's people's thinking?
We flagged it as a gap when we talked about it. So we're going to reach out to A&R. Rural Water is a different association, but I think either one or both, I think would be helpful.
Okay. So you guys are going to try and work on this over the next month to see if you can hone some things there. Okay, great. And then co-chairs, I guess the same thing. So Joe takes this good comment and the thought, make sure additional things are added to the matrix that were suggested as needed. Plus, think about revising these slides a little bit further.
Yeah, I'm hoping all these comments are being recorded. I haven't been taking notes, so it's kind of hard to take notes and listen to what people are saying at the same time. So we can go back.
It would be great if we can. I mean, the chat has really valuable information in there. I'm hoping we can get access to that and send it out to the subcommittee.
Okay.
Afterwards. And Marion, I think I see you nodding.
Obviously this is being recorded. The chat is, I can get it. It's in a really horrible text format, but we can certainly share it afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I'm aware of time, so probably just to get everybody in, let's move to pathway 3 to Anne.
You're on mute, Anne. Do you want me to pull it up or do you want to?
Nope, I've got it.
Yeah, she's ready.
Nice.
Okay, so this was an effort with Chad Farrell, Dave Snedeker, myself with a lot of help from Marion. And let's see, I'm going to get rid of the view here. Sorry. So this is our pathway 3 to support the reduction of municipal school district, residential, university, and hospital fossil fuel use in rural areas through equitable practices that address the unique challenges of rural communities. And I think our pathway is the most, it's really close to pathway 1, and I can really relate to Chris's need money, need people, need time. So in our first strategy, it's basically assessing data needs and, which is a job in itself, and then establishing best practices for all these different entities that we're trying to work with. So I've kind of summarized what they are, and I think one of the best new ideas that we had in our meeting with Chad and Dave was to increase it's the 5th bullet, to increase public education. Wait a minute, no, it's not there. It's the 3rd one, engage higher education to develop systems to gather, compile, update, and extrapolate the data to be made available to the public. Let's see, what else can I say? We only have 2 strategies. So that maybe makes it a little easier and maybe shorter so that you can keep up, Patrick, on our timeline. So on S2, we kind of changed that up a little bit. Strategy 2, to equitably expand access to programs that provide options to all these different entities. And I think in our actions, we got into quite a bit of detail. We were thinking about all the different programs that are out there, to particularly promoting, maybe we were a little more focused on weatherization and not so much on some other ideas, other things like the transportation impacts on households. But I think we came up with a couple of things that are kind of interesting, like the idea of helping households upgrade their electrical systems, like if they're going to need a EV charger and they only have a 120 electric box. Let's see, then a new one. I was pretty taken with the weatherization at scale program in the EAN pitch last summer, or actually it's about a year ago. They're working on some pretty similar things that fit in our category, I think. So we should keep in touch with them because they're producing a report very soon. Their goal is to weatherize all homes that are essentially low income by 2030. That's an ambitious goal. So I'm going to go to, unless there's some questions now, which I can't see. I'm going to go to, so maybe you could help.
Yep. Yeah, you're good so far. No hand. No
Okay.
hand.
Thanks, Patrick. So we'll go, I'll go to slide 2, which these were some of the things we wanted, we just thought were useful for discussion. So develop a statewide program that supports on-bill financing for energy efficiency upgrades. And I'm not sure I was able to capture in my own brain what all the issues and roadblocks are around that, but does some of this have to do with how our utilities are regulated or not in the state, and how some of them are, they're different styles of entities? Anybody have a comment on that one?
You comment on bullet 1 there.
Yeah.
And just to be clear about this, when you mean on-bill financing, that means that?
I think that this was Chad's idea. It was his suggestion, and he's not here today, but I think what it meant was that you if you do some investments, you can partially pay for them through your
Yeah.
monthly electric bill. Is that?
And like my
is that-
Tesla power walls, I pay for each month.
Through your bill.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lease program. I think he's talking more about if you wanted to do investments in weatherization or things like that at your home, finance it through the bill, which has been talked about in the past as well.
Mike, do
Yeah,
you
I
know?
think that is what he was talking about, and we actually have a separate action, I don't know if it was captured in here, about modeling programs on the Tesla Powerwall lease to own program through GMP. So that's sort of a separate action than this one.
And Mike, any quick reaction to the bullet one, just about barriers, challenges, regulatory or statutory or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, Ann and I have talked about this too, is different utilities offer different things based on their resources. So Ann, I don't know how you would respond to that. We're the only ones offering the Powerwall right now as an example.
Sam.
And I assume-
Yes, the other end.
Yeah, I was just starting to put in the chat. We had a whole clean energy finance chapter in our last comprehensive energy plan. I didn't write that one. Ed Delhagen of our shop could give you some more insight, but I think you may be talking about, so there's on-bill financing, which requires a conduit through the utility. And I think there is an opportunity through GMP to do that for some investments right now. I don't know the status of that. I would like to get back to you on that, but there's also the property assessed clean energy program where you can repay for your weatherization, for example. It's attached to your property tax bill. And that requires, there was actually a big statewide movement around that maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But it required basically the towns had to the select boards had to go in and activate that program. And there was some, I think, pushback from some of the towns in terms of just like the priority. If there was a default on paying property taxes, the first thing that would need to be paid back is that property tax assessment to pay back the clean energy, and then the actual property tax became subordinate to that. So I think that was a challenge for a lot of towns, but happy to follow up on some of that.
That would be helpful. And I think, Marion, maybe you remember that did come up in our discussions, the idea that a municipality has got enough on its plate and it doesn't necessarily need to be strapped with any other things that it has to do.
And this is maybe a question for the group. So I think Catherine Morris, who also follows the cross-sector mitigation, noted some of these things are probably in the cross-sector mitigation recommendations or actions too. So are there thoughts about how we just would be redundant in some cases, or we try to find connections? Chris, did you have a thought on that? Chris, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. Efficiency Vermont does collect a lot of data on,
Yep.
I know they do electricity, but they also do fuels. So I think that may be already done. So you may want to just check in with them. And then I think to the extent that we position our stuff about like expanding existing programs, I think you'll have more luck than kind of creating new. So I just advise on kind of what your strategies and actions are. And this is related to the EV stuff. Right now there is like $1 million grant program to help multifamily houses install those panel upgrades. So, I think couching it by like expand something that's working to do more or broaden, the utility of that may be, that's just my thought.
Right.
Thanks.
And again, just because it looks like cross-sector may have some of these same actions or recommendations. Is there any thought, co-chairs, Marion, how we just coordinate with him if there's some redundancy here? And maybe it doesn't matter at this point.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Pat. And I think this pathway initially was built off of the need to pull cross-sector recommendations and think about how to design actions that help rural communities implement the recommendations that cross-sector is putting together. So there is very much a need to coordinate with cross-sector. I will say, throwing Chad into the bus a little bit because he's not here, I've been kind of asking Chad to pull some of the actions from cross-sector because he is that liaison to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. We haven't quite gotten to that point yet. So I think there does need to be coordination there. We completely acknowledge that there is overlap, but haven't been able to pull those yet, primarily because cross-sector just presented their actions at their meeting on Wednesday. So there just hasn't been, and they did not really have a full list of actions prior to Wednesday. So so completely acknowledge, and I think Anne and Dave will agree too, that there is overlap, and we know there is overlap, and we need to be able to build off of those actions. We just haven't been able to see them yet because they were just pushed out this week.
Okay, great. And anything else you want to cover here? Oh, Mike Burke, you had a comment.
Yeah, one more thing, and this is again Ann Margolis. Like I think of what Ann Lawless was asking me. So expand programs and equitable access. I really think you are asking, is there an action on how to do that? So for instance, the Powerwall GMP has a broader scale. We can reduce peak. There's ways that we can make the cost work there where some smaller utilities don't. And I think you might be asking us, is there an action that we could put in there on how to make that equitable to small utilities? And I just wanted to say that out loud. And I don't know if Ann Margolis had any thoughts, because I know you've wondered that same question on how we might do that. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a parallel effort afoot for us to figure out from the department side how to enable that statewide, whether it's taking advantage of what you guys already have or enabling a statewide flexible load management platform. You know, I think we hint at it in our pathway 2 around a statewide distributed energy resource management system. It's a slightly different type of software, but it's aiming at the same purpose, to allow other utilities to basically leapfrog over that upfront investment and just have the incremental device cost at that point. So I think we can try to tweak ours to get that in there. But you know, enabling broader use of financing tools was definitely a recommended action in our last comprehensive energy plan, and we can send you that exact language, and I'm going to try to track down what that exact barrier is to having more of that as well.
Right, thanks. Chris Campany.
Yeah, cross-sector mitigation is talking about this, and Liz Miller, and I think that she talked about this in cross-sector, but I know she and I emailed about this. The concept of, just like you've got the energy efficiency utility and efficiency Vermont, creating like an electrical transition utility or something to support this broadly. And I just put in chat the whole 100 amp service issue that the whole state of Vermont has with our older homes, and how quickly people are going to chew through that. And it's going to take more than just, apartment programs to make that kind of upgrade happen, just because of the cost related to it.
Right, Chris, that's very specific and helpful. Okay, so timing wise, any other questions or comments on this? And then again, there'll be some conversation with cross-sector and kind of sharing. And any other questions you have of the group in terms of just refining this further at this point?
I really like what Mike just said about making programs, I'm sort of summarizing, making programs equitable across the large and small utilities. That, that summarizes, that kind of fits with the on-bill financing would be one thing. Another thing is the Powerwall. So I think we should take another look and make sure that that is reflected in all the goals, all of our actions, not just the ones that we've highlighted right now.
Great. All right. Anybody else? Anything else on this one before we go to number 4, pathway 4? And thank you very much. Really good work. One thing maybe we want to come back to, I'm not sure how important it is at this point, is whether we need a common format across the groups in terms of presenting, but let's come back to that.
Yeah, definitely.
Each of you has done something different. It's creativity.
Well, I don't think it's a huge deal yet, because I think there will be some guidance hopefully coming out about presentations to use for action presentations of the Climate Council. I think this was just for us internally to present, so I wouldn't worry too much about it yet.
Good.
I was just trying to give your eyes a break.
Yeah. Well, and Vermont Climate Council, note all the various formats, so you have lots of examples to draw from to give us back a good template. Okay, group 4, pathway 4. Chris, back to you, I think.
All right, mute again. Why I volunteered to do 3 of these is beyond me, but this is the big crazy one. This is what started off in our group is smart growth. It evolved a good bit, and now it's more broadly just kind of land use. And this one, this one's going to take some discussion and a lot more work. There's, obviously going to be some potentially controversial, but probably very needed conversations around land use, because I just don't see how Vermont adapts to a changing environment, how it meets any of its greenhouse gas emissions, its sequestering goals without a better framework to control how things are built and developed in the landscape. Just put that out there. So quickly on this one, I'm just going to try to run through these as fast as possible and just flag ones where I could use some input and some direction from the group. We rolled up a lot of the strategies. Again, they're kind of long, and I think they could be refined. But the aim is, ostensibly we're kind of, for lack of a better word, we're kind of the urban side, the developed side of the coin of land use, and ag and eco is looking at the farm and forest. And we really need to come together to make sure that our strategies are aligned and working together. And I don't know when that needs to happen, but it does need to happen. Maybe after we get our initial drafts together, then we can have that conversation. And then it also needs to have a check-in with probably cross-sector too, because transportation is a big component of our emissions, and that's linked to our land use.
Really quick question for Marion. Marion, to Chris's point he just made, what is the thought about beginning to look at the specific strategies and actions across at least the 2 groups soon? What's the thought there?
Well, we've already started to do that. We came together as a group with for land use. We polled folks from rural resilience, ag and ecosystems, and cross-sector, and didn't perhaps have the correct representation from each of those subcommittees, but in our best effort, we got together not to talk about substantive issues, but to talk about process for how we align the substantive work coming out of the subcommittees that are thinking about this, most particular ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, who really are thinking about land use more holistically as primary pathways, and really a recognition of trying to do a better job in the climate action plan of elevating land use, as well as creating a pathway for it to speak back to the different strategies that it's attempting to mitigate or hit, so that in an effort really that, as Chris alluded to, folks like Joey and Gina working in the transportation space would feel some comfort that it was being carried forward as a primary pathway in the other 2 subcommittees with some consistency to speak back into cross-sector, but so that they themselves wouldn't have to move forward with it. This is long-winded to say that we had what I thought was a pretty good articulated process to move forward with after that meeting. But because of the CAP drafting process being articulated and discussed at the steering committee meeting, we didn't want to get out of turn with what we saw as the responsibilities of that group to move forward. So we sort of hit a pause button. And with the changes that evolved at Tuesday's steering committee meeting, we've not necessarily hit unpause, but we have included in our framework for how we're thinking about CAP drafting land use as the broad example of a cross-cutting idea that needs attention, and a proposal on how to do so that we plan to engage with the council on Tuesday. So yes, we have some ideas and plans that I actually think will proceed very similarly to what that meeting discussed, but just perhaps with different representation around the table going forward. Hope that's clear enough.
No, thanks, Jane. Chris, back to you.
So I'm just going to go through the strategies really quickly, because I think we're just going to run out of time, and I bet everybody has a comment they want to make. So, modernizing our land use governance, regulations, practices. We want to support compact development. We want to protect areas that can store floodwaters, protect people and property downstream and upstream. We need to adapt our community. We don't know what the futures are going to be, but we need to start doing this work now. And this is a little bit of an overlap with Joe's, including resilient design and construction standards for our centers and buildings. Improve coordination across agencies. This is what Catherine was getting at. You know, our permitting framework needs to be aligned to consider the changes, a changing climate, or the changes on the land that climate change is going to affect. And then just, I don't know how you want to do these discussions, but, you know, one of the action items was to create, you know, a state land use plan to guide this. There's an idea to create a state planning office to do this. These are all controversial ideas. So I just want to flag that for the group. The other one kind of, you know, river corridors, you know, it's been on the books for a little while, but how it's regulated or how it gets implemented and local community level is challenging. And there was an idea that the state, you know, take over this kind of regulation. I'm sure Mr. Campany would have some additional comments on that. So I'm going to just pause there, and then we've got more slides, but maybe we should have a quick chat. Or
Chris, do you want to, how many more strategies do you have for this one?
There's one more. There's two more strategies.
Maybe let's just see the universe, and we'll come
Okay,
back.
great. All right, next slide, please. Then.
It's coming.
All right. This is kind of the other side of the coin that I mentioned. There were a lot of strategies around that we need to talk to Agnigo about. But we have a lot of at-risk buildings that need to be bought out. We have the buildings that are damaged repetitively, but they don't meet FEMA's requirements. So the state needs to step up and kind of figure out a way to fill those gaps because we don't want people living in harm's way. And then generally, you know, the state, there's efforts to gather good data on land use, but we really need to do better. We don't necessarily know where all the housing units are. We don't know where they're built. We're just not rolling this stuff up as well as we can. And good policy is informed by good information and data. And I think we need to do a better job doing that. One of a specific example, you know, municipalities, you know, they regulate land use, but we don't really have a great statewide picture of what this looks like and where the gaps are in our regulations. And this kind of touches on what Chris Campany was talking about. Some towns regulate, some don't. How do we sort that out? I'll stop there.
Okay. Chris Campany, in fact, as you anticipated, Chris Campany, first word.
And I'm going to comment on something you weren't necessarily expecting. On the establish a statewide conservation and buyout program, I don't know if it fits here, but something we're doing that I'm hoping that we can build the capacity of all RPCs to do is a habitat connectivity project, looking at how do we maintain and improve habitat connectivity. Other terms for that is forest block preservation or reducing parcelization. But I'm just wondering if under that strategy, establish a statewide conservation and buyout program, if you might consider, I don't know if it may even be implement conservation design policy or something to that effect.
I actually made a mistake. There's two more slides that actually touch on that. So my mistake.
Oh, good. Okay.
More strategies are coming. Two more strategies coming. So let me get there. I thought this was the last of it. So sorry.
Okay. And Chris, while you're getting there, just one other thing. I don't know if we want to play around with this or not yet, but to me, one of the biggest challenges I see in Vermont is that there's no aggregator of funding between towns and the state. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying it's necessarily the regional commissions, but it's one of the disadvantages we have of not having county government, frankly, county taxation, because elsewhere in other states, you've got an aggregator of public funds that can implement regional scale projects and intermunicipal scale projects. And that may get to the whole governance efficacy thing that I posted in chat earlier. But in my mind, it's a challenge that Vermont has that makes doing a lot of things we say we want to do a lot harder, not having that funding source in between the town and the state level.
Chris, do you want to go to the last two slides?
Last slide, yeah.
Catherine.
Here you go, Chris. Sorry. You know, conservation design, you know, basically lays out kind of where these areas, these important forest blocks are, these important connectors are. it's a kind of a vision, but there's really not a lot of regulation behind it. And how do we do that?
Right.
And there's a very specific strategy on how do we protect these certain key important parcels.
And this is where I think there's a lot of crossover to the ag and eco too.
Right,
Right. Sure.
And you know, we were reluctant to just really cut all these down, you know, for practical reasons until we had that conversation. So this is just a snapshot, and there's a few, you know, potentially controversial conversations, difficult conversations around land use that are needed, I think.
Exactly. Do you want to, Catherine, I think over to you. You had your hand up.
Thanks. Good work. I think where the previous land use discussions that we've had at the larger scale really made it clear that from an ag and ecosystems perspective, there should be a clear delineation between the built environment and the conservation world. And so when we look at and where we focus on the built environment, so going back to strategy 3, I think, action 1. So the previous slide. No. The next one. That one, the statewide conservation and buyout program, and then looking at the hazard prone properties and the attenuation area strategies. I really think from our perspective, if we could reword that a little to ensure that that's in service of protecting our compact settlements.
Yep, that's a great point.
Because that's really what we want to make sure we get at that.
Right. Otherwise, that's a really good point, Kevin.
Yeah, that's the intent, but yeah.
Right. So if we can just tweak that wording a little bit, I think that would be really great. Thank you.
That's great. So there's another thought in the comment chart. So let's, Chris, go back to numbers, the first 2 strategies, because I have a feeling that's where the controversy is. So I'm just curious what people want to say about, you know, this continued struggle in the country in New England between kind of local and state control and equity reasons, money reasons, and getting stuff done reasons. So I'm just curious if we want to have a conversation about this now, and the Climate Council likely will have to face up to some of these hard questions too. Thoughts or comments on any of these pieces?
Catherine wants to lead the charge.
Over to you.
Her hand
I
is.
forgot to put my hand down.
I was ready.
I'll say what I will say, since you called on me, is that I may not 100% agree with what's written here, but I 100% agree that it should be out there as proposed actions.
Great. Mike Burke.
Yeah, we had a discussion back on pathway 2 about the permitting, and Catherine, I think, brought it up. And I do think the second strategy here is where I think we thought about having that conversation previously, and where it does bring all of the goals together in the permitting process versus I'm only looking at water. I'm only looking at, so I do think this is probably where we might want to catch that, but obviously we'd be open to putting something in 2 as well. But I just wanted to highlight that, Catherine, as you mentioned it before.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I do have like word. I mean, if not now, there even wording that might fit in here somehow would be really helpful. Other comments about state land use plan, moving floodplain and river corridor policy to the state. Other thoughts?
Anthony, your mom.
I know it's. Where's the controversy, people?
Well, I have a question. You know, these are all sort of what government is going to do, and maybe that's the intent. But I'm just wondering, is there a role for developers? You know, whether they're private developers or they could be institutional developers, they could be, you know, non-profit housing developers, and also I'm thinking about the banking or the financing side of this. Is there a place for that group of people in, you know, under this strategy? Because they're the ones that actually make the investments and probably have much more influence over the development pattern than all the regulations that we have. And so, you know, I know it's I don't have a good answer for that. You know, what is their role in all of this? They're sort of, they're regulated. And I think about just, it's interesting in the utility side, just sort of listening to Ann and Mike talk and kind of work things out. Ann is the regulator and Mike is the regulatee, and they work together and they somehow, it all happens, but it's a different framework. So I guess for those of you that are the land use experts, it's like, what is the role of the universe of developers that are out there? Do they have a role in this climate action plan when it comes to land use or not?
It's a great point. I just don't even, we talked about needing to engage with them and getting them involved in this process, but they're hard to nail down. I think you're right. I think we do need to chat with them or check in with them. And a great point about the banking community, what they finance is what gets built. But I think they're largely, dictated by a lot of, federal statute and rules. But it may be outside of our control, but it's worth a conversation. I know a lot of the federal financing supports a lot of the rural sprawl that people are concerned about.
Well, maybe there's an action somewhere in here just about, engaging and coordinating with them to try to make these things work, right? As effectively as they can.
There's a comment from Catherine in chat. If anybody wants to respond to. Including the nice commentary. I had a question. It was maybe from one of the earlier strategies, Chris. Maybe it's actually covered in here in the buyout program. Is this notion of is not only kind of making sort of hardening or protecting infrastructure from vulnerability, but also moving it when it no longer makes sense to protect it. And I don't know whether that gets captured in 2 or gets captured here in 4 under buyouts. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's some specific strategies about hardening buildings that maybe can get a little wet, but maybe are not super risky. And how do you align those different programs, to identify which really need to be bought out, maybe which ones need to be elevated and flood proofed.
Okay. So,
but
Mike Burkhardt.
I was just going to say along that same line, not only know when to abandon something, but also in the permitting process, when infrastructure first goes in, have it go in resilient instead of putting something in that's going to be hard to maintain. And we actually have an action like that back in Pathway 2, but the conversation you just had made me think about it here as well, because we are covering permitting more here than back in Pathway 2, but maybe that's reason we should cover permitting in Pathway 2 as well. We can think about that.
Trust you're speaking from experience about this. Catherine,
I might be, yes.
There is no action on the Groovy 70s sighting, but I'd be happy to include that.
So I guess, Chris, you're going to continue to work this one. We know.
Yeah, it's a big one that's going to take some more conversation to wrestle down and narrow down. I think, looking forward to I don't know what the ultimate prioritization process is, because right now we have too many actions. So I think we need to keep an eye to that.
Good. And if we have time today, we'll hear just briefly what the next steps are for that from the Vermont Climate Council and Steering Committee for sure. All right, so it looks like, again, probably more conversation to bear, but any other comments on this for now? And then otherwise we'll go to number 5. All right.
All right, 5 is me too, just can't get enough. Arguably, housing is a subset of land use and development, but it's so critical to the state. It's foundational to everything that we need to achieve. So we felt it was important to actually pull it out as its own strategy. So some of these ideas are kind of related, but we tried to just pick out the ones that were specifically linked to housing production. We have an affordable housing crisis. We have a great opportunity to make a dent in it, but we need to do it in a thoughtful way to make sure that people are safe. So similar to the prior strategies, this is around walkable centers, creating nodes of activity to make transit work, to reduce emissions, to allow mode switching is the first strategy. improve safety and quality of resilience of the existing housing stock, several strategies around that. One of the things that Catherine felt strongly, and I do too, is about creating, a rental registry and inspection program. We've got some poor quality housing stock, and without a framework to actually take a look at that and make sure that there's tools and resources to make those improvements, it'll be really hard. And in the event of a disaster where we need to find people homes quickly, we currently don't know where all the rental properties are. So this is, I think, an important and critical step. This wasn't a bill last year that the governor vetoed, so I'm just flagging that it is, potentially there's some differences of opinion on this one. So wanted to elevate that. Similar to before, we don't do a great job collecting data on housing and what that looks like. ECGI has done some interesting work about land cover and how Vermont has developed over time, but we could do more. And to seeing how we're doing. And there's I think some pretty simple steps we can take. The tax department and municipalities collect grand list data, but it's never been rolled up in a way to actually tell us where things are being built. Something like that may be a small step that actually could give us some pretty good information about how the state's developing, and are we doing a good job, or are we developing, I should say, developing consistent with our goals, or developing in a way that's not consistent with them. And this whole last strategy is about equity and making sure that everybody has access to fair and affordable housing.
Right. Is that all of them, or is there more?
Yeah, I think that's the last one is just, the last slide is just under this, we moved some of the potential housing related actions that were put in here to other pathways. They just seemed more appropriate to us. And this is part of that kind of maybe our next step conversation about how all these things get crosswalked and making sure they're in the right place, making sure they're clear, making sure that we're all on board with where these things land and what they say.
Okay, great. All right, so questions on number 5 here from folks, comments or questions?
Oh, I guess we're at that point of the meeting, huh? Everybody's
Friday afternoon at 2:38. So I want to be clear. So I think each kind of lead, right, is going to take, I think there's the broader matrix to fill out to make sure it's complete, right? And then there's these slides, which we're just having as conversation pieces. So
yeah,
co-chairs, do you want to just make sure we're clear about what next steps are for everybody? And I think you have a better sense than I do what those should be.
I may have to defer.
I see Marion's raising her hand.
I was gonna follow up on whatever you all said, so just getting out in front of it.
Just given the conversation today, it might be helpful to have all of this in like the next generation of a spreadsheet, so that if we have to do further refinement, we're doing it all off of a single format. What do you think about that, Marion?
Yeah, so my suggestion, and I'm just assigning myself more work, I think what makes sense is for me, and I can send this out today, is a copy of the chat. So at least folks have that as a reference. I also have sometime on Monday, I can take notes, sort of rewatch this at like a higher speed, take notes based on pathways and send that out to you all. I think what would be helpful is for the pathway leads, either based on notes you've taken today or things I send out with the chat, is to send me back your Excel documents. I'll put that all in one place and make sure the formatting's okay. And then I think there should be columns already for sort of questions. I know that that was the format Bronwyn was using. I think we adopted that with Pathway 3. I don't know about Joe's, the infrastructure pathway, but start to list sort of, does this need more clarity? Is this need to be reworded in a certain way? And I can flag those, and then we send those out for review next Friday. I think just thinking about our timeline, again, we want a full copy of these actions posted for the council to review by the 21st. So that gives us next Friday's meeting to kind of clean up, do some last minute check-in with developers or whatever other, I know like Pathway 3 wants to talk to someone from Efficiency Vermont. So if we can try and do that this week, clean those up, kind of review it. on Friday, and then think about what Catherine and Erica are going to present. Well, actually, we could do that on the 24th, so we have a little bit more time there. But I think review that spreadsheet and just flag any last minute, comments or crossover that comes up. Sorry, I'm thinking about this on the fly, but
The question, so for getting the council, like the more detailed, strategies and actions in a lot of detail, is that something that they're expecting those to be having fully vetted by the subcommittee? So if the subcommittee is essentially in full agreement about them, or is it it's a companion of what we thought about, some which may or may not be full agreement, but it's our universe for now? I think it's just because if they do need to vet, next week is going to take some time to go through actions that people may not agree with. So.
And then a specific question related to me. I know we are going to talk more about land use, but with the other committees, is there a meeting date set? Do you know for that? Just
no, because
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll need to get that set so we can meet this timeline, I think.
So I'm hearing, in terms of file format, folks that developed your PowerPoints, put your strategies and actions into the original spreadsheet that Marion sent around, and send it to Marion, right? So you can consolidate it in one file, Marion.
Yeah, I already have most of them, but if you have updates to make, send them to me. I'm compiling it into one master document, and I'll share it out with everybody. But because Chris and Bronwyn are covering 3 of the 5 pathways, it's already in similar file format for at least 3 of those. So we can share that, at least that format. I don't know, Joe, have you received that? Chris, did you share that with Joe?
I thought you did. I didn't share it to him with him directly. It just has a few more columns to enable kind of sorting.
Oh, I did share it, Joe, I think.
So good.
I'm thinking, I didn't find those columns to be all that useful to what we were doing, which is really if you need to be able to go back and resort everything in 3 different ways from whatever it used to look like in the past, I guess we could spend time doing that. But I think it's really about making all the edits we need to sort of clean this up and streamline it and make it look good, and make sure the actions are actionable. And I just see it as a big editing exercise at this point. And I can certainly put it in the spreadsheet if that helps, but the spreadsheet's not really that easy to edit in either. But that's what we're all working in. So I think that's our biggest challenge right now for the group that I'm in, is just taking that long list of semi-strategies, semi-actions, and turning them into something that is meaningful.
So Marion, to Joe's question, do you need everything in that Excel spreadsheet? Essentially, is that the common template for the details?
Yeah, send it to me in the Excel spreadsheet. If you're not using like the coding columns, Joe, that's totally fine. So
okay. I'll take that.
Yeah, so just send me, at least if it's in Excel, I can organize it and kind of have it look all the same. And then we will want a column for like questions and notes and points of clarification, but I think most of them have that already.
And let me check with Anne. You're okay with that too?
I think so.
I have bars from pathway 3 already. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to go over it again and go over my handwritten notes and see if there's anything I missed from when we were going over P3.
Yep.
And maybe
sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
I always say that this timing generally seems great in terms of setting us up for a presentation at the Climate Council when Eric and I are supposed to do that. I don't think it's realistic to say that we will have achieved the point by next week where we're all endorsing all of these actions. But what we would be endorsing is the idea that these actions should be put out there, especially given that we haven't even begun our public engagement work at the Climate Council level. I think it would be premature for us as a subcommittee to endorse a collection of actions at this point.
We also have an analysis that will be talked about in a couple of minutes in terms of that will help with prioritization. So
right.
Right, and we have the engagement event next week, Wednesday, so we may. come in
Wednesday.
on Friday with, Wednesday, exactly. We may come to the meeting on Friday with a whole set of new ideas based on conversations. Hopefully not, hopefully we're on the same page with folks, but.
Marion,
How exciting, new ideas.
Suggestion, I could just, a suggestion, maybe, you know, it's just like we did today, it's an opportunity to bring up some of the actions that maybe are the most challenging or potentially controversial, or that we think are really good, and we just want to kind of put out there, because you're only going to be able at the Climate Council, just like we did today, and maybe not even that much. I mean, that's, but if there's anything, so maybe that's what we should all be thinking about, is like, just look for the most promising or / controversial ones that, you know, we want to make sure are on the radar screen.
So, and just to be clear too, so Marion, one is, when do you expect people to, when do you want to get people stuff back to you on the spreadsheet version, by when?
If folks can send it, yeah, sorry, I'm trying to think. If it seems reasonable to send me updated stuff by Wednesday morning, then I can compile and start to
We're
make
meeting Wednesday afternoon, so.
Well, no, not for the rural engagement event. I mean, I think for that, I'll send out an email after this with the chat once that's uploaded, but as pathway leads or members of these pathway groups, if you all just flag certain actions that you think would be helpful for discussion and send those to me, I'll work with Catherine Morris on sort of a format for some of the facilitators to be able to use to spark conversation in the breakout groups. Or if you all are attending the breakout groups as participants, you can bring those up. But I think in terms of compiling the Excel spreadsheet for us to review next week, Friday, if folks can get me your kind of updated Excel spreadsheets by Wednesday morning, then I can get those out on Thursday.
And then second thing is, should people not focus anymore on their slides and just focus on that Excel spreadsheet and getting it up and running? Or what should people do with the nice as they did today?
I think for now, just let the Excel, or just focus on the Excel spreadsheets, because we just need to get everything in one place and start to look across pathways. We can focus on the presentation to the council the following week.
Okay. Catherine, Erica, that'll sound okay to you?
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Okay.
And again, I want to just express one more time a huge appreciation to everyone who put so much work into moving these strategies and actions along. It's really quite remarkable, the work that you've done.
On that note, I want to give a special recognition to Bronwyn Cook. We took on 3 of these. We couldn't have done it without her help. She worked incredibly hard. So thank you, Bronwyn. She's not able to join us today, but for the record, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brian.
Someone named Bronwyn on this call.
I think she's here. Or
Okay.
Ron.
Good. I'm glad
there
you
she
heard this
is.
then.
Okay, so I think the last 2 things we had, co-chairs, was just a quick update from Jay and I on the prioritization framework and equity lens, and then public comment. So.
All right, Jane, you want to go?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. In addition to thinking about how the CAP will be drafted and put together at the steering committee meeting on Tuesday, we also started to talk a bit about prioritization, although because the conversation around the CAP drafting went long, we didn't get into a deep dive around the prioritization process that we've worked to propose on behalf of the council. So my hope and expectation is that steering committee members and or others who have seen it now, specifically those steering committee members, were asked to provide any feedback or comments by the end of the day today to inform how we present it to the council on Tuesday. But we are really hopeful that it's a straightforward prioritization process that looks at how you combine and consolidate your pathway strategies and actions. And then that first screening of how you move actions to ready for implementation versus needing further development, I should say. And then a prioritization process that utilizes the foundational criteria that we've been exploring with the council and others to date, which are 5 criteria around equity, co-benefits, impact, progress towards GWSA requirements or measurable goals as you have, technical feasibility, and cost effectiveness. We've attempted to propose definitions for the council to consider around those 5 criteria. First, making sure those are the criteria we all agree upon, Second, ensuring that we agree upon definitions and how to evaluate those based on the actions put forward. So we're gonna run through that in more detail on Tuesday with the council in hopes of approving it to bring back to subcommittees to roll out. Obviously, one of the large components of those criteria is the equity screening and the application of the tools developed by Just Transitions. The good news is that we have a consultant coming on board to support subcommittees and council in the application of the scoring rubric and evaluation tool. We're finalizing contract negotiations today and into early next week, but hopefully that person will be on board by early to mid next week and be able to give clear guidance to subcommittees and the council on expectations and timeline for that work over the course of the next few weeks, with the hope and recognition that that will all happen pretty quickly once that person's on board. So there's a lot coming. We don't expect prioritization to have occurred, as you just discussed, ahead of your presentation on September 28th. But hopefully, if there's time next week, we can roll through the prioritization more closely and start to think about the ready to implement versus needing further development and how to screen that with respect to your actions. And then think about what prioritization and how that timeline will unfold for your work in future meetings. So hopefully that's helpful. The council will have a lot to discuss on Tuesday. Hopefully the council will take action on all of this, as I know subcommittees are anxious for guidance on it.
So just a little clarity. So somebody's going to actually, this consultant's going to review the actions and run it through the process?
So the intent, you know, the council has early on, we adopted an approach around equity that included operationalizing equity within the council and subcommittee work. So our understanding and expectation was that rather than how some states have actually handed off their work to consultants to do an equity assessment, this is our attempt at empowering subcommittees to do it themselves, mind you, of time. So they will walk through, my understanding is at a subcommittee meeting, you'll do some pre-work to screen actions that you want to think about and hold hands with the consultant on to really dial through and discuss. But there'll be some expectation that that will essentially be training you to do that screening for all the actions, so that you can give some relative score to equity for all of them.
Thanks for asking that question, Chris, because that's different than what I understood until you asked that question. I thought it was the first way. So that's an additional load of work we're going to have to think about how we schedule it, it sounds like.
Jane, can you just remind us on the big overall schedule, like when is all this supposed to come together in the draft plan?
Yeah, so that sort of, we've had in our background a schedule around drafting and how state staff with counselor engagement, either directly in writing or through timely delivery of drafts, can support the components of the CAP that don't have primary authors, as well as how to support the roll-up of work coming out of subcommittees. We had sort of held back on that, as at the end of July, a proposal was put forward to the steering committee that wasn't on the agenda at that meeting, but came to the agenda right at the beginning of August to really flesh out a formal process for counselor engagement in the drafting of the CAP. That sort of is a wrong way to put it. That unraveled at the steering committee meeting on Tuesday for a number of reasons. And Marion and I were tasked with holding true to the components of that, the responsibilities outlined in that CAP drafting process, because we very much have never saw it as a state drafting or a counselor drafting. It's always been sort of an all hands on deck to meet the timeline. And really, in order to be successful with the December 1st deadline, counselors in particular need to be engaged all along in the process so that we don't have unforeseen challenges at the end. So on Tuesday, there'll be a very detailed, well, actually, this afternoon in your email, you will get a very detailed drafting schedule with very detailed timelines of when things will go to the council, when the council will have the chance to discuss it, and when written comments will be due and revisions. So hopefully that will provide the clarity and transparency that I know has been missing from the process to date. And so that will be discussed on Tuesday. I am sure there will be modifications to what we propose, but hopefully that clarity will be more apparent after Tuesday.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions for Jane about timeline, prioritization, equity?
How are you guys holding up? Sorry.
Still
I can
sitting.
answer that on a non-public meeting.
Yeah, was that a rhetorical question for everyone, Chris?
It is.
So last item on our agenda is public comment. And so I'll open up the floor for anyone to make public comment that hasn't already been made. And just feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in. All right, well, hearing none. Next meeting is next week. I think we've talked through generally our process and what we can expect at that meeting. Anything else, Eric, you want to add?
I don't. Have a
All
wonderful
right.
week.
Yeah, have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks so much for all your work.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.